substantial argument. Follow us on YouTube.
And then you've got what I've been saying now way back in the 1990s. The idea is for this Third World War to involve Russia and China against the West.
Yeah. Oceania versus Eurasia, yeah.
Yeah, in the 1984 kind of scenario. And what you have now is the demonization of Russia. Have you noticed that? How suddenly we got the demonization of Russia? And what's opening up in the Ukraine, while all this is starting to go on in the Middle East, is another front against Russia. Because, you know, it's very easy to see how Russia can be pulled into this Middle Eastern conflict by supporting Syria, because destroying Syria is part of ISIS's agenda and American agenda and NATO's agenda.
And also Iran as well.
Yeah, and destroying Iran, yeah. So, and Russia would come out in support of Iran, and the same would happen with China. And so you can see how it's how the pieces in the game are being moved around to create this scenario that Pike talked about. And the idea is to basically bring everything to its knees, so that the world would have to be rebuilt in its structure and the way it operates, and that would be in the image of what they've been working towards all along: world government, world central bank, world army, world currency, centralized control of the planet. It's very easy to see with current events how it's moving in that direction, and we need to understand what the goals are, to understand what the moves towards that goal are. And when you look at it from this perspective, what is happening in the Middle East is not random. None of it's been random. Libya's not been random. Syria's not been random. None of it. And ISIS certainly isn't random. It's part of this long-term plan to take over the world by creating enormous chaos to which they can offer the order out of the chaos, their order, their new world order.
Hello and welcome to this videocast and podcast for subscribers to davidicke.com. Well, anyone who's been looking at my work over many years will know that I've been going on and on and on and emphasizing again and again that the plan of this hidden hand that I've been exposing is for a third world war, and has been all along. There was always planned to be 3 world wars to completely transform human society into the image that this hidden hand wants, i.e. a global, centralized, fascist dictatorship. Can anyone now not see that the puzzle pieces are being moved into place ever quicker to bring about this third world war, an effort to pitch, as it has been all along, the West against Russia and China? When I started talking about this, there was no evidence in the public arena that this was happening. But look at it now. All we're having is the constant, incessant, so transparent demonization of Russia and increasingly China too. And the 2 presidential candidates in the United States, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, will both be potential front people to front up this third world war, with Hillary Clinton absolutely enthusiastic about it. It's no accident that even in her presidential campaign, she's using every effort to demonize Vladimir Putin and Russia, because Clinton has been an asset of this hidden hand for most of her adult life, and thus she will be ready to come in and really push on this already fast unfolding process of triggering World War III. And it's so blatant. You've had the situation this week where the investigation into the taking down of flight MH17 over Ukraine was blamed in effect on Russia. The point is, the way these institutions work and the way they are centrally controlled, there was no way in the world that any other verdict was going to be made other than the story put out by the United States at the moment the plane was shot down was the version that was true. Nothing to do with the facts. That's the version, that's the narrative, and each of the institutions that represent this cabal in their various forms are going to make sure that they are in sync with that narrative. Hence, there was no way there was going to be any other outcome than it was the Russians. We've also had this claim that Syria stroke Russia were responsible for bombing a aid convoy, a UN aid convoy in Syria. Evidence to support that? Zilch. But it's pushing the narrative. In fact, the UN, that kind of went with the US version to start with, then started backtracking because the evidence wasn't there to stand it up. And much of the evidence came from this increasingly notorious front for the West, the so-called white helmets in Syria, who are funded by the US, the UK, the EU, and other NATO countries. I'm sure they're completely impartial. Of course they're not. They're there to represent, at least at the leadership level, to represent the interests of those that fund them. And we've also had this situation where the United States bombed Syrian troops, killed more than 60, injured another 100, while they were fighting ISIS in Syria. And then said, oh, sorry, it was an accident. No, it wasn't an accident at all. First of all, it apparently went on for an hour. Well, it's a long accident. Secondly, the moment the bombing started, the ISIS were ready and prepared to take advantage of that. And the Russians had to tell the United States several times that they were bombing the wrong target before they stopped, because from their point of view, it wasn't the wrong target at all. It was helping ISIS, or was planned to. ISIS being a front for the West, as I've gone into in great detail many times. If you want to justify many things, then create an enemy. And this situation of the bombing of Syrian troops was also to try to goad and poke in the chest some kind of reaction, which can then be used to justify conflict breaking out. So what we have in Syria are the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Turkey, Russia, in the background, increasingly less in the background, more vocal about it, China, Iran, in that relatively small area, all those countries, and it's a disaster, a massive conflict waiting to happen, exactly as planned. And when you look at the sequence of events, it's so blatant what has happened. First of all, in September 2000, you had a document published by a group known as the neocons, or neoconservatives, the power behind the Boyd Bush administration. In September 2000, this document called for multiple theater wars to be fought by the United States to regime change in a series of countries which they listed. Among them were Iraq, Libya, Syria, Iran. They wanted regime change in North Korea and in China. And as a result of the inside job that was 9/11, they had the trigger to start the process of that sequence of multiple theater wars and regime changes to start when the Bush administration, with these same people, came to power a few months after the document was published. And indeed, in that document, these neoconservatives, people like Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, Dov Zakheim, all these major players in the White House and in the Pentagon, they said that this process of transformation, this series of regime changes, could really only be moved along with any speed if there was a catalyzing and catastrophic event like a new Pearl Harbor. 1 year to the month after the document was published and that statement was made, 9 months after these people came to power with the Bush administration, the United States had what Boyd Bush called at the time the Pearl Harbor of the 21st century. As a result, this same list of countries has been picked off with Iraq, with Libya, with Syria. It's all part of a long planned series of wars and conflicts leading to global domination, not least through a third world war, pitching the West against Russia and China. And it's so blatant, it's so obvious what's happening to anybody who is studied at any depth what's really going on behind the claims that these events are all random. Let's look at some of the things that have happened this week in relation to this. Here we have a headline, US Ambassador to UN, the notorious ambassador to the UN, hints at removal of Russia from Security Council over Syria. This is this lady who lies for a living. If she ever told the truth, she'd genetically implode. Samantha Power. She said this week, what Russia is sponsoring and doing is not counterterrorism, it is barbarism. Well, I bow to the United States and Britain and other NATO countries, but particularly the US and Britain, when it comes to expertise in barbarism. It's a killing machine, the combined military and political efforts of the United States and the United Kingdom. Instead of pursuing peace, this liar goes on, Russia and Assad make war. Again, you just go on the internet and put in wars fought by the United States since 1776. It's absolutely shocking, the number of wars that the United States has been involved in. And then you do the same for Britain over its history. These are killing machines combining their forces. And they condemn others for not supporting peace. Instead of helping to get life-saving aid to civilians, as if they care, how many civilians have been slaughtered by this Mr. and Mrs. Evil of world politics, the United States and Britain? Instead of trying to help life-saving aid to civilians, Russia and Assad are bombing the humanitarian convoys. Evidence? Zilch. Hospitals and first responders who are trying desperately to keep people alive. Oh, they care, these people. Especially when they're bombing civilians. They care about civilians. What are they saying in Libya? We must bomb Libya to protect the civilians from violence. It's unbelievable. The audacity of these people. It is time to say who is carrying out those airstrikes and who is killing civilians. The United States. No problem. Russia holds a permanent seat at the UN Security Council. This is a privilege and it is a responsibility, yet in Syria and in Aleppo, Russia is abusing this historic privilege, which the United States and the United Kingdom have been doing all the way through since there was a UN Security Council. Now, Britain gets in. Oh, all the hypocrisy that America gets in its arrogance while it's dealing in its mass slaughter while condemning others for killing people. All that the hypocrisy that the United States has got has come from its parent, the United Kingdom. When it comes to hypocrisy, it's major league, top of the league. So let's have some more this very week. Britain's UN ambassador, Matthew Rycroft, joined in the chorus saying that Russia would be excluded from the process of bringing peace to Syria based on the recent intensification in fighting. The Russian bid to bring peace to Syria is very, very near the end of its life, and yes, the Security Council needs to be ready to fulfill our responsibilities, said Rycroft, without laughing or dying of shame. The regime and Russia have instead plunged to new depths and unleashed a new hell on Aleppo. Russia is partnering with the Syrian regime to carry out war crimes. Oh, frickin' really? Here's a quote. It's from the former French Minister for Foreign Affairs, Roland Dumas, on French television. And it refers to how this Syrian conflict began. Which country could he be talking about, I wonder? The suspense is unbearable. This is what he said on French television. I'm going to tell you something. I was in England 2 years before the violence in Syria on other business. I met with top British officials who confessed to me that they were preparing something in Syria. This was in Britain, not in America. Britain was organizing an invasion of rebels into Syria. They even asked me, although I was no longer Minister for Foreign Affairs, if I would like to participate. Naturally, I refused. This operation goes way back, he said. It was prepared, conceived, and planned. In the region, it is important to know that this Syrian regime has a very anti-Israeli stance. Consequently, he said, and I have this from the former Israeli Prime Minister who told me, we'll try to get on with our neighbors, but those who don't agree with us will be destroyed. Well, a number of things come out of that. What he's saying, he experienced and was told in Britain before the Syrian conflict broke out with rebels funded, armed and trained by the West. In fact, many of the same rebels that had just done the same to Gaddafi in Libya. That fits absolutely with what is clearly the case, that these rebels are not a natural, spontaneous revolution against the Assad government, the Assad regime, but actually have been put in there as a proxy army for the United States and Britain. And the other thing is the mention of Israel. Israel is simply a fiefdom for the Rothschilds. They created it, they own it, they control it, and they've used that little sliver of land in the Middle East to be the point of conflict with so many other countries. And in the background, Israel will be fundamentally involved in this, and no doubt eventually, if this process moves on, in the foreground too. And Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, who one of whom will be the next president of the United States, they are owned lock, stock and barrel by Israel. And when Israel tells them to jump, they break the Olympic high jump record. That's the situation, and that will be the situation whichever of the two come to power. So while Clinton will be the most enthusiastic purveyor of World War III, of the two of them, the same process will unfold, whichever's in power, because the Rothschilds via Israel and via the United States and the United Kingdom have had this Third World War plan in place for decades and decades and decades and more, going back into the at least the latter part of the 19th century. So now we've had this comment this week, extraordinary, but not if you know what the game is, from this US State Department spokesman, John Kirby, another in a long line of dummies put up before the media to represent the State Department and the White House, just parroting lies, parroting nonsense. Anyway, this John Kirby said this week that Russian cities and even shoot downs of Russian jets would happen or could happen if Vladimir Putin continued his fighting and bombing in Syria, which is actually overwhelmingly targeted at ISIS and all these other groups connected to ISIS and with the same agenda of ISIS that are all funded by the United States, NATO countries, etc. This is what Kirby said. Extremist groups will continue to exploit the vacuums that there are in Syria to expand their operations, which could include attacks against Russian interests, perhaps even Russian cities. Russia will continue to send troops home in body bags and will continue to lose resources, perhaps even aircraft, Kirby told reporters at a press briefing, adding that if the war with Syria continues, more Russian lives will be lost, more Russian aircraft will be shot down. Now that is not a prediction. That's a threat, quite blatantly. And it was picked up by a spokesman for the Russian Foreign Ministry, who said, don't you think that some such ventriloquism about body bags, terrorist attacks in Russian cities and loss of aircraft sounds more like a get 'em command rather than a diplomatic comment? That's exactly what it is. It's telling Russia what's coming if they don't come to heel. And the reason all this is going on is because the plan was to create ISIS and these other so-called moderate groups slaughtering people, to get rid of Assad, to tick Syria off this list of countries that these neocons from an organization called the Project for the New American Century had planned way back before 9/11. And by now that would have happened. Assad would have gone. But Putin intervened in support of Assad. The Chinese, in a less obvious outward way, are doing the same. And as a result, the plan's gone screw whiff, at least at that level, of removing Assad, because Russian air power, not least, is preventing the outcome that was desired all along, to remove the Assad regime. And so now they're getting more and more desperate to find ways of getting rid of Russia so that can happen. But there's a much bigger agenda, even beyond all that, which relates to World War III. So then we come to this other threat this week from this bloke, Ash Carter, the US Defense Secretary. NATO is reviewing nuclear playbook to deter terrible attacks by Russia, this Carter said. And another aspect of this Third World War is they do want it to go nuclear. It may sound crazy, anyone would want that, but if people read my books at length and come to the events I'm doing around the world, they'll see the puzzle pieces put together to show why all this is desired by these crazy, insane people. So Ash Carter stated that the US and its allies had not built any new nuclear weapons or delivery systems in the last 25 years, and that American nuclear forces must be ready to engage in a possible nuclear confrontation with Russia. It's not obvious what's going on, is it? He said Russia has long been a nuclear power, but Moscow's recent saber-rattling, the United States and the United Kingdom do nothing else. And building of new nuclear weapons systems raised serious questions about its leaders' commitment to strategic stability, for which the US and UK have none. Their regard for long-established accords of using nuclear weapons. The only country to drop nuclear weapons on another people are the United States. And whether they respect the profound caution that Cold War era leaders showed in respect to brandishing their nuclear weapons. Two things. The Cold War was never meant to end up in a conflict. That was planned to come later with what is happening now. It is planned to happen now. And that's why what is unfolding every day on the news is happening. Brushing aside the fact that so far that US remains the only country, this story says, that ever used nuclear weapons against another state, Carter said that a diverse and dynamic spectrum of nuclear threats in the world could prompt some nations to use these weapons on a smaller scale. This is what he's talking about, what the plan is. To counter the perceived Russian threat, Carter stressed that the US and its NATO allies in Europe are, quote, refreshing its nuclear playbook to integrate conventional and nuclear deterrence, quote, to ensure we plan and train like we'd fight and to deter Russia from thinking it can benefit from nuclear use in a conflict with NATO. What you have to do with this, and I'm not saying Russia's perfect, Iran is perfect, Iran is far from frickin' perfect, or China is perfect, far from frickin' perfect. I mean, are you having a laugh? But the point is, if we're going to get streetwise about what's going on, we have to look at the way this game is being played, not at our prejudices or opinions about the various players. And the whole point about this situation that Carter was talking about there is they want to bring about some kind of nuclear exchange in this Third World War. Moscow keeps in mind US readiness to use nukes, prepared for countermeasures, the story says. Of course, after someone like the US Defense Secretary comes out with that stuff, then there's going to be a response. And Russia said, we will keep in mind the US approaches and take necessary countermeasures to ensure our national security. And they said that the United States was planning a dangerous game. In fact, Vladimir Putin has said quite clearly over the last few months that's the game, that the United States is looking for World War III. And then you have a series of fronts against Russia and China that are being systematically put into place. One, of course, is in Syria. The other one is in Ukraine. Ukraine had that political upheaval called a people's revolution, like Icke was, when they put in this guy Poroshenko as leader, who, as WikiLeaks emails and communications have shown, was a US asset long before he became leader of Ukraine. He was put in there by the United States. And the person that put him in there was a lady called Victoria Nuland. Victoria Nuland, head of Eurasian affairs at the US State Department, just happens to be the wife of Robert Kagan, one of the co-founders of the Project for the New American Century that came out with that document in September 2000, calling for all these countries to be subject to invasions of various kinds and regime change. And once that Poroshenko change happened as a result of a US instigated People's Revolution, brackets coup, they started kicking off about Russia. That was in many ways the trigger for the demonization of Russia. And then in terms of China, you have China now also more vocally supporting Assad in Syria. But you also have what's going on in the South China Sea, this conflict between China over who owns what and who has rights to what in the South China Sea, which the United States has got heavily involved in. And also the conflict along the same lines between China and Japan in the East China Sea. And what has come out this week is that the United States is apparently planning deployment of THAAD anti-missile systems in South Korea, because North Korea is an ally of China. And China has subsequently warned against that. The Chinese Defense Ministry has warned the US against deploying the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System in South Korea. On Wednesday, Washington released a statement that it is going to deploy the system as soon as possible. We will pay close attention to relevant developments and consider taking necessary actions to protect national strategic security and the regional strategic balance, spokesman for the Chinese Defense Ministry said. As cited by Reuters, what needs to be stressed is that Chinese people mean what they say. And so you've then got these conflicts in the South China Sea being wound up again by the United States. So before our eyes, in the most obvious way, the pieces are being moved around to create a situation where World War III will break out, which has been planned for reasons I go into in the books and the talks for so long. And the mainstream media, they just look on. They don't put the dots together, the pieces together. They just report the world as it's all random and it's all this and it's all that and it's not coordinated. Oh, goodness me, there can't be a conspiracy. They don't exist in the mainstream media, do they? And having spent the last month in the United States watching what passes for the mainstream media there, I'm surprised that, well, without the internet and the alternative media, this wouldn't be the case. But I'm surprised that the people of America know anything about the world at all, because all you get is basically at the moment it's all election. But even when there's not an election, you get this narrow number of stories, sometimes 3, 4, 5 a day, on the main rolling news channels that just repeat program after program after program, covering and discussing this, poring over the same stories, and the world goes virtually completely unreported inside domestic America by these corporate news sources. And so people, understandably, unless they go on the internet or go to the alternative media, have a completely distorted view of what's happening in the world, because that's what they're told. And it really is time now for people to start taking responsibility, because if people don't get informed and don't act on what they subsequently understand by getting informed, then this World War III will unfold, and they do want it to go nuclear. They do want it to pull in country after country after country, and they do want to tear this world asunder so that afterwards they can rebuild it in their image. That's the game, and it's happening day after day after day, ever more blatantly. So I would say to people, put your prejudices down about Russia and China and ones you may have about Assad, and just look at what's happening. Because whether you like Russia or whether you like China or whether you like Assad really doesn't matter, in the sense that they are vehicles to bring into conflict countries that would bring about this World War III. And it's happening. And if we don't start looking at it dispassionately and seeing how obvious it is what's happening, then it will unfold, not least if, and most quickly, if Hillary Clinton gets in the White House. You know, this is not conspiracy theory. This is not pulling things out of the ether. It's happening. It's happening on the television news day after day after day. And we need to focus on it because it will be to the eternal regret of humanity if people don't.